As snow covered a narrow mountain road in Alaska, Frank, a rugged elderly outdoorsman, found his rusted blue van stuck in a snowdrift during a brutal storm. He was heading back from a supply run to a remote village when the weather took a turn and forced him off the road. Frustrated but calm, he stepped into the freezing wind to check on the failing engine. While disconnecting the battery, a soft, trembling cry rose above the howling wind. The sound startled him. It wasn't part of the storm. It was something else. Then it appeared, a small creature bounding through the snow. Almost invisible with its white fur, a tiger cub limped towards him, its body soaked and flecked with snow and pine needles. Its eyes held fear and sadness. It showed no threat, only desperation. When it reached him, it gently tugged at the hem of his pants with its teeth, clearly begging for help. Frank's first instinct was to back away. This was a wild animal. But the cub didn't feel dangerous. He stood frozen, stunned by the moment. The cub tugged again, then looked toward the woods and back at him, as if trying to say, "Follow me." Despite every urge to stay near the van, Frank found himself walking. The cub turned and led the way into the forest, stopping every few steps to make sure he was still behind. Frank grabbed his heavy coat and a flashlight from the van before trudging after it. If this ended badly, at least it'd be one hell of a story for the gods. The trail was rough. Snow reached up to his knees, branches whipped his face, and his flashlight barely cut through the storm. He had no idea how far they had gone. Still, the cub pushed on. It stumbled often, its body trembling. But it never gave up. Something important waited at the end of this path. Frank could feel it. Then, past a crooked pine, the cub stopped. Frank followed its gaze and saw her. A full-grown white tigress lay slumped in a shallow dip beneath the trees, half buried in snow. Blood matted her fur, one paw twisted at a brutal angle, the other pressed against her chest as she let out a low roar of pain. Her eyes, clouded with agony, shot open when she saw Frank, and she bared her teeth. Frank raised both hands slowly. His heart pounded. He wasn't there to harm her, but she didn't know that. She growled and tried to rise, but her injured paw gave out, and the sound she made was raw and piercing. The cub rushed to her side, nuzzling her, but even he was pushed away with a weak growl. Frank stood there on the edge of that small, snowy clearing, unsure of what to do. He couldn't walk away. He couldn't heal her, and the snow just kept falling. The tigress, injured and struggling, kept her eyes locked on Frank with fierce distrust. Frank, not used to being this close to a wild predator, felt the cold bite of fear in his bones, but also a deep pull of sympathy. The cub's quiet whimpers and the mother's labored breaths made it impossible for him to walk away. He crouched slowly, speaking in a soft, calm voice, trying to show he meant no harm. The tigress couldn't understand his words, but something in his tone or movement seemed to make her hesitate. As a small act of peace, Frank placed his wool scarf in the snow and stepped back, hoping it showed he wasn't a threat. Still, the tigress stayed tense. Her breathing was shallow, and blood oozed from a deep wound on her paw. Frank could tell the injury, likely from a metal shard or broken trap, was serious and infected. If she didn't get help, she would die, and the cub wouldn't last long either. Frank grabbed his emergency kit from his backpack. It was basic, just some gauze, pliers, disinfectant, but it was all he had. As he slowly approached, the tigress let out a fierce growl and lunged, slashing his chest with her good paw and sending him flying into the snow. He lay there, stunned and aching, cursing his age and stubbornness under his breath. The cub rushed to him, eyes wide with worry. Frank managed to smile through the pain. He still had fight left in him. After catching his breath, Frank remembered a pack of jerky in his van that might help build some trust. He forced himself through the storm, each step burning, and returned with the dried meat. The cub was curled up next to its mother, trying to keep her warm. Frank waved the jerky and tossed a piece toward the tigress. She sniffed it, then ate, slow and weary. No growl this time, just exhausted eyes watching him. Frank took his chance. Moving carefully, he knelt beside her. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, but the fire in her was fading. He flicked on his flashlight and inspected the paw. Wedged deep between her pads was a jagged metal shard, rusted and cruel, likely from a trap left behind by humans. It was the source of her agony. Frank whispered quiet apologies and reached for his pliers. The tigress trembled. Then came the roar, a sound so sharp it shook snow from the trees. The cub cried out, circling her protectively, but Frank didn't stop. Bit by bit he worked the shard free. His hands shook, blood soaked his gloves, but he didn't let go. At last, with a sickening snap, the metal came loose. Blood poured freely now, but the wound was clean. It could be treated. Night had fallen over the quiet wilderness of Alaska. Frank sat with his back against a crooked pine, arms hugging his sides as he watched the tigress breathe. Slow, heavy, but steady. The cub lay curled against her, its small head resting on her flank, eyes barely open, but still alert. Around them, the snowfall had formed a fragile dome, wrapping them in a white, hushed shelter. Frank's hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion. He had done everything he could. The wound was cleaned, the bleeding had slowed, and she hadn't tried to strike again. That had to count for something, but doubt still bit at him. Infection could creep in. She might not last the night. And if she did, maybe the last thing she'd do was lash out at the one fool who tried to help. He dropped his head to his knees and muttered about his 68 winters and the sheer stupidity freezing beside a dying tiger. But deep down, something pushed back. He hadn't dragged himself this far just to give up now. Then, he felt something. A warm weight pressed against his coat. The cub had snuggled beside him, its tiny body curled close in quiet trust. Frank's breath caught. No words, no logic, just something real and ancient. A bond carved out of fear, hope, and survival. The tigress stirred. Frank went still. Her eyes fluttered open. She lifted her head just a little and looked straight at him. No growl, no baring of teeth, just a long, slow blink. That blink said everything. She saw him now. Not as a threat, not even as a man, but as someone who didn't leave. By dawn, the snow had stopped. Frank stood up with a groan, bones stiff and sore. He stretched his legs, moving around the clearing. The tigress was watching him again, her head lifted higher. The bandage still held. The bleeding had eased. The swelling looked better. The cub was already on its feet, hopping through the snow, chasing flakes and tumbling in little circles. That energy, that spark, it was back. Frank chuckled softly, watching it bounce around. He knew he couldn't stay. His van was still stuck miles away. He'd have to hike out and find help. But leaving her here, even now, pulled at something deep inside. What if she got worse again? What if something came for them after he was gone? Then again, maybe she didn't need him anymore. As if sensing his thoughts, the tigress shifted and rose, limping but standing tall, snow falling from her battered fur as she nudged her cub beside her. Haruto smiled, eyes stinging, and turned to leave, gripping his walking stick as the cold bit through his coat. But before he could vanish into the trees, he heard the snow shift, turned, and saw her looking straight at him. She took a few painful steps, then bowed her head, just slightly, not as submission, but as recognition. Haruto stood still, nodded once, heart heavy and full, then walked on without looking back. He returned to the village and said little, not because no one would believe him, but because some stories aren't meant for casual telling. They're sacred. And months later, as spring cracked the ice and green crept back into the world, Haruto found 2 fresh paw prints at the edge of his property. One large, one small. He smiled, said nothing, and stared into the woods with a quiet knowing of a man forever changed by a single, stubborn act of compassion.